I have a prop again today. Well, somewhat a prop. It's a necklace with a red stone in it, and it's round. Okay, it's the closest thing I have to the jewel thing that they have in Secret of NIMH. Although this one is not magical. Or at least not as far as I'm aware, it's not magical. I've had it for several years now, and it's done nothing except sit on my jewelry rack and of things that I don't wear very often. So another non-Disney, non-DreamWorks animated movie. This is going to be about The Secret of NIMH, which came out in 1982. So this movie is actually 2 years younger than my sister. So, there's that. So The Secret of NIMH, it's based off of a book called Mrs. Frisby and the Rats of NIMH. Yeah, Mrs. Frisby. I love that. And it's just a children's science fiction fantasy book by Robert C. O'Brien, and it was illustrated by Zena Berenstein. I have no idea if she has any relation to the Berenstein Bears. And the movie is obviously an adaptation of the book from about 10 years prior. It must have been popular enough that they decided to make it into a movie. And the movie was actually produced by Don Bluth, who would later end up doing, several other movies that I will end up talking about. But, he did Land Before Time. He did, I believe, Fife Will Go, The American Tale, and Anastasia, and Titan A.E., and a bunch of other movies, Thumbelina. Most of these movies will be movies that I will end up talking about during this whole run of different, non-Disney, non-DreamWorks animated movies. And such. And the Don Bluth movies were pretty much just as much a part of my childhood as, the Disney movies. Although, when you're a kid, you're unaware of the fact that these are technically a rivalry, because Don Bluth at one point worked at Disney. And because of, what was going on during that time frame in, the late 70s, he wasn't really all that interested in working there at the time. And he left and took a bunch of other animators with him. And then those were, the animators that started up, this other production company. I do not remember the name of the production company, but started up this other production company. For animation and everything, and made these other movies that were kind of this rivalry type movies to Disney, because they were fairy tales for kids and stuff like that. But I enjoyed them growing up, and I'll be talking about a lot of them. So, into the actual movie. Do you have an itch? Do you have an itch? I'm a dog. I do what I want. Yeah, I know you do. So going into The Secret of NIMH, first we are introduced to this character, and actually the first thing that we see in the movie is this very old, aged hand writing in this very big, tome-like book. And then as we get, this narration of, Jonathan Brisby died today, and his widow will never know why, and she must, mourn him, and blah, blah, blah. And then we see a glowing red necklace. And then we cut away to where we are introduced to Mrs. Jonathan Brisby, as she is referred to, or just Mrs. Brisby, as she is referred to for the movie. And she is just this little field mouse that lives on this farm owned by the Fitzgibbons. And her children live in just this little sealed-in cinder block house in one of the farmer's fields. And she is currently on her way to go and talk to Mr. Ages, or Dr. Ages, who is this very kind of eccentric older mouse who is apparently very, very smart and enjoys science and things like that. And Mrs. Brisby goes to him, and she's getting medicine because her youngest son, Timmy, is sick. And throughout this, we get this, interaction. He's, kind of this, crotchety old man. But he's okay, fine, yeah, I'll help you because your kid's sick. And he, we see him use like lots of pulley systems and different things like that you're not expecting mice to use. I mean, like, it's going off of the whole like these animals are far more intelligent than they should be, as like what gets shown in like Cinderella and other movies like that. Because like in Cinderella, the mice are smart enough to make a dress, and in this mouse is smart enough to be able to make like something that can help with pneumonia, because that's what the little baby Timmy mouse has, is pneumonia. And so he gives Mrs. Brisby this antidote and sends her on her way. And on her way home, she ends up coming across all of this string. And then tied up in this string is this very clumsy but friendly crow named Jeremy. Jeremy is kind of the comic relief character for this movie. And he's talking about how he is, trying to gather up as much string as he can so he can make a love nest that'll be very colorful and hopefully attract Mrs. Right. So he's trying to do that, and he's just all tangled up in this string, and Mrs. Brisby is like trying to help him get unstuck, but she's like, okay, you need to watch over that way toward the farmhouse and tell me if you see a cat coming this way, because there is just giant cat that is just like an evil cat that is like clearly like a reference to like Lucifer from Cinderella, with how much Lucifer tries to go after the mice. And this cat's name is Dragon instead, and he is not a nice cat. Then again, to be fair, farm cats are supposed to chase mice and rats away from the farm and kill them and stuff. So technically, Dragon is doing what he's supposed to do, but because of the perspective of this movie, and we're rooting for Mrs. Brisby, you don't want the cat to eat her, Jeremy. Unfortunately, Jeremy is allergic to the cat, and when it gets too close, he starts sneezing in its face, because it gets close enough to them as Mrs. Brisby is trying to, untangle him from the rope, from the string. After Dragon shows up, there's this huge kind of like, action-y chase scene-ish where like, Jeremy and Mrs. Brisby are trying to get away, and Mrs. Brisby kind of gets tied up in the string as Jeremy's flying up. And, Dragon is like chasing them, and it's like up a tree and around other stuff, and eventually they end up getting away from Dragon. And they end up in like an old mill where, they're safe for the time being. And during this time frame, they end up talking a little bit more, but Mrs. Brisby is very sad because she thinks that she lost the, medicine for Timmy. And Jeremy's just like, oh yeah, you dropped this, and like gives it to her, and she's just like so happy. We also find out when she was talking with Mr. Ages that Timmy cannot be moved for about 3 weeks. He can't go outside for about 3 weeks because he's very sick. Because the chill in the air could kill him. And the problem with that is that it's moving day time, which means that all of the animals that live in the Fitzgibbons Farms fields during, fall and winter and everything before it's time for the, farmer to plow the fields and everything to get ready for, planting season, all of the animals move. And unfortunately, they can't move, Timmy because he's sick. So that's kind of one of the problems. But Mrs. Brisby and, Jeremy, they survive the cat. They're fine. And Jeremy is just like very, very talkative and everything like that. As I said, he's very clumsy, but very friendly. And him and Mrs. Brisby just kind of keep talking a little bit, and like she, kind of leaves him and starts making her way home. We are introduced to her children, who are, if I'm remembering correctly, are Martin is her eldest son, Teresa is her eldest daughter, and then there is Cynthia and Timothy. And Timothy is mostly just in bed the majority of the movie, which is fair. He is sick with pneumonia. And the kids are all kind of, wondering like, well, Mom's back. It's kind of getting late and Mom's not back yet. They're kind of worried about that. But then they also have, there's this, community of animals, of course. And there's Auntie Shrew, who is just Shrew, who, will kind of help like watch over the kids. I kind of see her a little bit as like a little bit like, like Katie Nana in like Mary Poppins, where like, she'll be around the kids, but she's not the best with them, mostly because she doesn't listen to them very well. They keep trying to tell her that Timmy is sick, and she's not quite listening to them. So there's that, which is just funny. Also, she herself is kind of clumsy, but also very like hoity-toity. And the fact that she's like, I cannot deal with this, I am leaving, and then just like leaves and falls down the stairs again. She's there to deliver a message to Mrs. Brisby that, the frost has left the ground, so it's time for moving day. And, Mrs. Brisby is, I can't do that yet because, Timmy is sick. We can't take him outside. And they're like, okay, well, what are we going to do with that? So it's just like, okay, well, I got to give him his medicine. So the shrew leaves, and then Mrs. Brisby makes, a tea and then, soup with the medicine from Mr. Ages, and goes in and starts giving that to Timothy. As the other, her other children come in and, are kind of asking questions. And, like, there's this, like, sweet little, like, lullaby song in the background that gets played as we're, like, watching them. Just this little family moment there for her and her kids. And, like, she clearly misses her husband very, very much, but she has 4 children to take care of, so she will do what she needs to help take care of them. The next morning is when so first there's one other thing that happens before we get to the next morning. And we have it where we are kind of introduced to Mrs. Fitzgibbons, and she's talking to her husband. She's like, I got a call from NIMH this morning. And I was trying to remember what NIMH's acronym is. It's the National Institute of Mental Health is what NIMH stands for. And she's like, I got a call from NIMH this morning, and they wanted to know if we've been having anything weird happen with the rats on the farm. And she's like, I told them we haven't seen anything weird. And while this is going on, we're seeing like a bunch of rats have climbed into their house and like stolen like a wire of some kind, like an extension cord or something like that, and are like making their way through and like into this rose bush that is like out in front of the house. And she's like, yeah, they wanted to come, and I told them that, like, we have a bunch of rats that live in our rose bush, and like, but I said that they could call back and talk to you or whatever. And she's like, the farmer's like, yeah, whatever, I have to plow in the morning, I'm going to bed. And then we see the rose bush light up. Not fire, but like light up with like electricity. So it's like, okay, well, these are definitely not normal rats. The next morning, Mrs. Brisby wakes up and she ends up hearing the plow start up, the plow tractor start up. And, the shrew starts running through the fields, warning everybody else, all the other animals, that like the plow is coming. And so like they all start fleeing. Brisby gets her 3 children out of the house that are there, gives them to Auntie Shrew to send off to go take them somewhere safe, but Timmy still can't be moved, and of course she's not going to abandon her son. So Mrs. Brisby decides, I'm going to make that plow stop moving, and she ends up, as it's going through. Now, I grew up in Nebraska. I have seen plows and different things like that are designed to just like rip through a field to get it ready for planting, and I've watched it happen. Those blades, if you get close enough, can be pretty terrifying. And if you're a little animal who are in the path of these blades, yeah, it's very terrifying. It would be very terrifying. But she braves it. She climbs into the machine and she starts trying to like cut wires and chew through them and everything like that to try to make the machine stop. And because, Auntie Shrew ends up running in as well, and she like, cuts the fuel line and everything like that, so they're able to like halt the tiller machine. And, Mrs. Brisby is just so stressed right now because it's like, well, I can't move Timmy, but we have to, and blah, 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 and I don't know what to do. And Auntie Shrew is like, you need to go and see the great owl, and who is supposed to be the wisest creature in the forest. And Mrs. Brisby is just like, you're aware of the fact that owls eat mice, right? I can't go there. He'll eat me. But it's like she really has no choice in the matter. She has to go to the owl because like she doesn't have any other solution at the moment to try to move her family's house. Or move her son. And, you know, so that's going on. But we have this other moment where we have like this other very aged figure kind of watching her from this, like, it's a magic mirror reference type thing. Watching her through that and like, you know, kind of like urging her to go and speak with the owl. And she does. Like later that next day, Jeremy flies her into the forest where he flies her to the tree of the great owl. This is a great creepy looking forest. It's awesome looking and the tree is freaking creepy as well. And I love that. I love background art from like and scenery art and stuff like that from movies in general, particularly where it's ones where you can tell that they were like hand painted or something like that, like from like older classic Disney movies up through, you know, even up through other areas where even now like stuff is based off of like hand painted things to a degree. And in these movies as well, it's very much, you know, hand painted. You see that with Studio Ghibli movies and different things like that, where it's clearly been designed to just look gorgeous in the background. And by technicality, it's just supposed to set the mood. Some people don't even really pay that much attention to what's being shown in like the background stuff, but I love it. I love that detail. There's movies where it's just like you could go almost frame by frame in some movies and just like almost any frame in that movie would give you like just like this gorgeous background shot with like just everything lining up perfectly that like you could like frame on a wall. And like there's frames from like Ghibli and stuff like that. I was just like, I would love to have this framed on my wall. You know, on a very nice canvas with like a nice frame and everything like that. I'd love that. But going to this, she makes her way into the tree. Jeremy is too scared to go inside. Not that I blame her. Not that I blame him. And Mrs. Brisby hears the owl, you know, come in, come in. And she starts making her way through the tree and eventually finds the owl and screams, which is right, which is fair, considering the fact that, you know, this is just giant owl that can very much eat her if he so decided to. And he's like looking at her and he's like, why are you here? And she's like, I've come because I need help. My house needs to be moved and it's moving day and my son can't leave the house because he's sick. And eventually what ends up happening is the owl's like getting ready to like leave and he goes like, you know, blah, 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 Mrs. And he like pauses and she's like, oh, Mrs. Brisby. And he's like, Mrs. Jonathan Brisby? And she's like, yes. And like that clicks with something in the owl because he knew Jonathan. And he tells her, go and speak to the rats that live in the rose bush. They can help you move your house to the lee of the stone. And she's like, what? What do you mean go talk to the rats? I don't know any rats. Why would they help me? And he's just like, he mentioned something about like your husband was very well known and everything like that and had lots of friends, including apparently the owl, or at least the owl was familiar with who he was. To be fair, we have no idea how old the owl is. He's an old owl. I also have no idea how old owls can live to. So, you know, and then he flies off and she's like, okay, well, I survived that. And she goes and Jeremy flies her back home. And she's like, okay, well, I guess I need to go and talk to the rats that live in the rose bush. So the next day, that's what she does. She sneaks her way through the fields to where the rose bush is. And we see her looking around, trying to find a way in. We also see Jeremy showing up and having additional antics going on with him. And she's like, okay, she's like literally like thinking of like, okay, I cannot put up with you right now. What else can I do with you to make you feel like you're actually helping? Go watch my kids. She's like, go watch my kids. I live blah, 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 blah. And he's like, oh, okay. And he like heads off to go and like help keep an eye on her kids. that doesn't go well for him, but I'll get to that in a little bit. And Mrs. Brisby then ends up finding her way through like the rose bush and into the entrance, and she starts making her way down through underneath the rose bush. And she starts seeing like all of this different stuff that just looks like so many different layers that are just like so different from each other, and some of them are just so gorgeous. And then she comes across like this guard rat that then like scares her, and she runs off, and then she runs into Mr. Aegis, and she's like, what are you doing here? And he's confused as to why she is there as well. And she goes like, well, she like kind of like laments a little bit more about the problem because it's moving day, but she still can't move Timothy and everything like that. And he's like, ah. And she goes like, so I went to talk to the owl. And he's like, whoa, back up there, lady. You went and talked to the great owl and lived? She's like, yes, he told me to come here and talk to the rats to help me move my house to a safer place. And he's like, oh boy. He's like, okay then. And he starts taking her through. And she's like, but what about the big guard rat? He goes, oh, that's just Brutus. His bark is worse than his bite, type of a thing, as they're making their way through. And they end up meeting then the captain of the guard, who is Justin, who is just this very, he's this very nice rat, very playful, I guess is somewhat charming in Mrs. Brisby's opinion, because, like, you know, he's like, and who are you, my lovely lady? And she's like, and Aegis is just like, this is Mrs. Brisby. And again, Justin is like, Mrs. Jonathan Brisby? And he's like, my honor to meet you. And she's like, it's clearly flirting, and there's like, okay, there's an attraction here. Okay. To be fair, Justin is very sweet throughout the whole movie, and he legitimately wants to help her. With, you know, helping her kids and everything like that. So there's that. And like they end up making their way through into this, I guess it would be like, I guess the rats version of like, I guess Parliament or something, or the Senate or whatever, to their council meeting, where one of the rat leaders, Jenner, is trying to convince the rest of the Rat Council to not follow the plan that has been determined by their leader Nicodemus, but which their plan is to move to this place called Thorn Valley, so that way they can be like self-sufficient there and not, you know, steal food and supplies and, you know, electricity and things like that from the farmer. And like, yeah, these rats have like technology that rats should not have. There's lighting in this place. There is electricity. There's like, you know, a whole bunch of other stuff that is just like, this is not the way this should work. This does not work this way. How do the rats have this? They should not. Type of a thing for like, why are these rats so smart? And like Jenner is trying to convince the rest of the group that no, we don't need to leave. We can stay right here in the rose bush and we can fight against the humans and blah, blah, blah. I'm like, no offense, as smart of a rat as you are, and as smart as a rat as this setup might be, I don't think you're going to be much of a match for humans. Humans can very easily plow your rose bush and get rid of it, so there's not much there. Yeah, so there's that. But what ends up happening is, you know, everybody looks over and they see that Justin and Aegis have arrived with Mrs. Brisby, and they're just like, who is this? You know, that's, you know, and, you know, the guests are not allowed here. Strangers are not allowed here. And they're like, and Justin goes like, but she's not a stranger. This is Mrs. Jonathan Brisby. And they're like, some of them are just like, oh my God. And then Jenner kind of has like a about face on this, and he's like, maybe I could use this. And because she's like explaining to them, like, I've come because the owl told me that I need you to help me move my house, and that you're the only ones that could do it. And they're like, you talked to the owl and lived. And they're like, they're just all baffled by this, which I just find hilarious. But Jenner and like his little side assistant, whatever, Sullivan, you know, Jenner's like, I could work this into my plans for how to kill Nicodemus. This might work. So he then like does an about face and becomes very charming to, you know, Mrs. Brisby. And I was just like, you are very not good at this. He's charismatic, I'll give him that. It's like the rat got Riz, but I'm like, I really don't want that. And so from there, they're like, okay, well, maybe we'll help you, maybe we won't, blah, 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 blah. And then Mr. Ages takes Mrs. Brisby to go and meet Nicodemus. Justin and Mr. Ages take her to go and meet Nicodemus. And she goes in, and we are introduced to this very, very old, aged, very kind and wise rat leader. And he's the one that we saw at the beginning of the movie, narrating kind of the movie, and like has been like watching Mrs. Brisby and everything like that, keeping an eye on her. And so we're introduced to him, as is Mrs. Brisby, and she's like, I don't understand how you guys have all of this, and I don't understand how Justin even knew you all, or how all of you were so familiar with my husband when I've never heard of any of you, beyond like, the rats that live in the rose bush. And he's like, well, there's a very good explanation for that. I'm like, I think this rat is, it's not based off of Dumbledore, because Dumbledore didn't exist at this point in time. Because this was way before the Harry Potter books came out at any point in time. But he's obviously supposed to be based on, like, Gandalf, like the very wise and old wizard that is very, able to give out advice and everything like that. The old mentor type of a thing that's supposed to die, something like that. So that's clearly what Nicodemus is supposed to be based off of. And damn, did they do a good job of giving him a lot of detail in regards to, like, his hands and things like that. For how, like, old he's supposed to be. And he's like, can you read? And she goes, I can read a little. And he sends her over to, like, this book. And it's the book that he'd been writing in earlier with, like, the journals of, like, what's been going on for, like, their colony, for the rats of NIMH. And she opens the book and she starts reading, and she learns what happened to her husband. She learned that Jonathan died trying to drug the farmer's cat. And she's like, I can read a little, but Jonathan taught me. The children are better at it, though, so we have that going on. And she's reading, so she's finding out for the first time how her husband died. And then Nicodemus tells her, he shows her, like, the magic mirror thing and, like, explains to her their past for, like, how the rats got to be this smart and everything like that, and how they know Jonathan. And it is revealed that the rats were just regular rats originally, who got captured by NIMH, the National Institute of Mental Health, along with other animals and mice, and how they were, taken and experimented on. And that, like, I think it was like 20 rats and 11 mice or something like that were given injections, and these injections ended up altering their DNA and making them intelligent to the point where they can read and comprehend how to do so many different things. And they're able to figure out, like, they can read the latches on their cages so they can get out. And eventually they end up making their way out of the NIMH facility, but a bunch of the mice got sucked into the ventilation system, except for Jonathan and Mr. Ages. And from there, Jonathan is the one that's able to be small enough to help get them out of the facility so they can all escape. And then, like, they all end up sticking together. And, they ended up, building up, like, the rat colony and the rose bush and everything like that. Again, we never quite get an answer of, like, how many years it's been. Because, and Mrs. Brisby asked, why didn't Jonathan ever tell me any of this? And Nicodemus is like, well, because of the injections we were given and the alterations made to us, we age much slower. And Jonathan didn't want you to know about that, because it would be you would age and waste away while he stayed young. And he didn't want to put you through that until it became necessary. Or didn't want you to be aware of that until it became necessary. I guess it's like being in love with Jack Harkness from Torchwood and Doctor Who. You'll age, but he'll stay the same. And what ends up happening is, so Nicodemus is telling her this, and how they help, how Jonathan had been attempting to drug the dragon so that the dragon would be asleep while the rats try to do something. try to do like this big part of a plan, but Jonathan got killed in the process. And he also gives her the pendant necklace thing that has something written on the back that was like, any door can be open as long as you have the key. And he explains to her that, you know, when worn by someone with a pure heart, then this will activate, type of a thing. And it's a pretty necklace, I'll give him that. And like nobody else is, I think, supposed to know about it, but Jonathan knew about it. It's implied that Nicodemus and Jonathan were very close in this regard. But he tells her that the amulet has like very great supernatural power when someone shows true courage of heart. From there, we have it that Nicodemus does very much agree that the rats will help with moving her house, so that they will work on that the next night. But they also have like this other plan that they're working on, which is trying to, you know, drug Dragon, which they kind of need to do anyway, because if Dragon wakes up and goes outside in the middle of the night where they're trying to move the house, then they'll get attacked. So what ends up happening is, you know, so Nicodemus has made this plan, and like, so him and Mrs. Brisby go off. And we cut to Mrs. Brisby's house, where we see that Jeremy has been tied up in his own string by the shrew. She's got him all hog-tied and everything, which is just funny. And then the kids come out, and they're like, well, Mom did say that she met a crow on the way home the other day. Maybe this is the same crow, and he took her to see the great owl. And Jeremy's like, yes, that's me. And like, he ends up going off on a tangent in regards to like, you know, your mom's talking to the rats and blah, 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 blah. And they're like, nope, never mind. Wrong crow. This one's lost it. And they hog-tie him again. Somehow Jeremy, there's a lot of J names in this. Jeremy, Jenner, Justin. Did they just like J's? Jonathan Brisby. Lots of J's. But what ends up happening is somehow he ends up getting free because we see him later. But what we also see is Nicodemus, Mrs. Brisby, and Justin are like gondolaing their way through the swamp to get her home, as like they're discussing something. And basically what ends up happening is Mrs. Brisby ends up volunteering to be the one to try to drug the drug Dragon, so that way you know, be able to, you know, move everybody safely. And they're like, okay. She also finds out a little bit more about the plan, that like, okay, well, our plan is to move to Thorn Valley soon, so that way we're, you know, no longer stealing anything from the farmer and all of that stuff, because it's wrong. And they're like, okay. And Justin is very like this very wide-eyed dreamer type of a rat in regard, you know, personality, because like he very much agrees with Nicodemus and all of this stuff, as opposed to Jenner, who is very much against what Nicodemus wants to do and wants power for himself. Justin does not want power for himself. He has the qualities of a leader, but it's like he doesn't want that power type of a thing. And so, yeah, Mrs. Brisby says that she volunteers to be able to be the one to go and try to drug Dragon. And they drop her off so she can start making her way home. And what ends up happening is she runs into Jeremy, again, who somehow got away from the shrew and the string and everything like that. And he's like, oh, you have a sparkly, because he really likes the sparkly necklace and everything like that. And she's like, well, the rats are going to help move my house. And she decides that, like, the best way to get Jeremy just out of their hair is to be like, Jeremy, would you like to help with moving the house? And he's like, yes. And she's like, okay, then I need you to go and gather up as much string as you can, because we're going to need string to move the house. And he's like, on it. And he, like, flies off to go and try to find the string. But he's like, if I bring back enough string, can I have the sparkly? And she's like, maybe. And he like flies off. So Jeremy's just kind of not there for until the end of the movie. But it's just like, he wants to be helpful, but he's not going to be helpful in these situations that are coming up. So we'll send him off on a side quest, basically. So that's going there. From there, we cut to that next evening, and Mrs. Brisby and Justin are like sneaking their way into the Fitzgibbons' house, into their kitchen. So that way she can, you know, put the the drugs into Dragon's food so that way he'll sleep. They're just like knockout pills, basically, is probably what it is. Just something to keep the cat asleep for the next however many hours. Unfortunately, Mrs. Brisby ends up getting caught by the Fitzgibbons' son. And is then, like, she's kept in the house and she ends up getting put into, like, this bird cage type of a thing with food and water and everything, but, like, she can't get out. And she needs to get out. And Justin is like, I'll have to come back for her later because they have to go and move the house while they have the chance. She did manage, I believe, to get the drugs into the cat's food. So Justin has to go and start help with moving the house. And Mrs. Brisby is trapped inside of the house. While she's there, she ends up overhearing Farmer Fitzgibbons on the phone with NIMH, and they're saying that they're going to come to the farm and capture the rats the next day. And she's like, oh, I've got to get out of here now because I got to go and warn them. And she... First, she tries to, like, open the cage by, like, untwisting, like, like those twist tie things that come on bread or on food or packaged food and stuff like that, trying to untwist that, but that's not working. And then she ends up figuring out there's the water dish where it's, like, part of it's outside, and if I can get it to go out far enough, then I can get out. And she eventually ends up, getting it to, go out far enough that she's able to get out, and then she uses string to, like, lower herself to the floor. So she's, like, using skills that she's learned. And she seems to be pretty smart on her own. She ends up having to run to the dragon, but she ends up escaping dragon. And she's, like, she gets out of the house and is working on making her way back home to, where the rats are currently moving her house. We cut to where the rats are. And, yes, they are doing as they said. They are moving the house with, like a rope and pulley and blocks and everything like that to get it out of the mud to then move it to where it will be in a safer spot. Where it's a spot where it's like the farmer's not going to go near this thing because it's, it's not worth trying to farm around or whatever. So that's what they're working on. And Jenner and Sullivan, who is his, like, kind of sidekick but develops a conscience in a moment, is like, okay, there's going to be an accident while we're in the process of moving this. And if we plan it at just the exact right time, we can, kill him in the make it look like an accident and kill him, and then I can take over as the leader of the rats. Sullivan kind of starts to, like, grow a conscience right at the end of this, as Jenner is, like, cutting the ropes to drop the block. The block itself misses Nicodemus, but the ropes and pulley system setup that they had land on him. Unfortunately, the heavy gears and everything land on him and kill him. And while this is going on, like, the children and Auntie Shrew are, like, all in the house. And Auntie Shrew was like, well, I don't believe these rats, type of a thing. And Jenner's like, well, the mom told us the rats are going to help us, so the rats are helping us. So Justin, or, Jenner is just like, blah, 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 trying to be like, the operation was a failure, unfortunately, and now there is no point in trying to leave here. We will return to the Rose Bush and continue our lives there where we are safe, and blah, 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 blah. At the same time, Mrs. Brisby shows up, finds out from Mr. Aegis that Nicodemus is dead. She's sad by this, but then she's like, oh yes, NIMH is going to be coming the next day to the farm, to the Rose Bush, and blah, 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 blah. So the rats have to leave tonight. And, of course, Jenner doesn't want to believe her. Justin does. And we get into this moment where Justin and Jenner end up, like, fighting with swords, because mice have swords, and we've entered Redwall territory now. Redwall, yeah. Who remembers Redwall? I do. That was a fun show. Fun books. I more watched the show. But they end up sword fighting. Not nearly as epic of a sword fight as what you see in, The Princess Bride, but still a good sword fight. During this time frame, Jenner ends up seeing that Mrs. Brisby has the amulet and tries to take it from her. Jenner protects her. And right before Justin protects her, and right before Jenner is about to kill Justin, Sullivan, who got injured by Jenner earlier, throws a dagger that actually kills Jenner and saves Justin's life. So that works. So Justin's fine. Jenner's dead. Nicodemus is unfortunately dead. And now they have to figure out how to move the house again. And Justin is kind of like yes, we will leave and everything like that. But, he wants to still help Mrs. Brisby with moving the house. Which is a good thing, because right at this point in time is when the cinder block starts to sink into the mud. Sink, and fill with mud inside where the kids are. And Mrs. Brisby is, of course, panicking about this. Justin comes over and tries to start helping with, trying to pull on the ropes and, try to figure out what they can do to try to save everybody. And the block ends up actually sinking all the way under the surface. And Justin has, pulled Mrs. Brisby away. Unfortunately, and during all of this, she is just like, oh, good God, my children, my home. Mostly she's worried about her children. It's just like the home is consequential. She wants to save her children. And during this time frame, the necklace starts to glow. And it ends up, she ends up touching it. It burns her hand. And then she, goes and picks it up again. And is able to, she puts it back on. And she's able to connect with its power. And kind of, via telekinetic manipulation, she is able to make the ropes lift the cinder block house out of the mud and then gently carry it over to where they were going to move it to, which isn't super far but still is a little ways. And they put it into the safe, and she is able to move it and put the cinder block house into the safe spot where it needed to be moved to. And then, all the pretty lights die down and she just kind of faints. As all the rats are just oh my God, type of a thing. And we cut to the next morning. And I mean, it doesn't seem like it should be the next morning, but it is the next morning because now there's a bunch of flowers around everything. But Timmy is doing better. He's on the mend from the pneumonia. And we have it that the now abandoned bush where the rats used to live is being inspected by NIMH. And Jeremy shows up and he's got a bunch of string because he honestly wanted to try to help. And he's like, oh, you're, via getting it pointed out to him, it was oh, your house got moved without me. Well, I'm sorry. He's like, well, now what am I supposed to do with all of this string? No girl's going to want me. So he's just sad about that. And while this is going on, Teresa, who is the oldest daughter, is bandaging up Mrs. Brisby's paws because they got burned while she was using the amulet and everything. So they're being bandaged up. And Jeremy is just but what am I supposed to do now? And then he ends up finding a female crow who is his Mrs. Right. So there's that. So they're happy now and they fly off and everybody's just happy. Yay. Happy family. Not really much else to go with that. That's the end of the movie. I know that there is a sequel that they did that I think is supposed to be about Timmy when he's a teenage version of a mouse, but I've probably watched it, but it's just been so long that I really don't remember anything else about it because I don't think I was all that impressed with it. But yeah, so I love The Secret of NIMH. Going into the cast list, there's not too many, but I will go over a couple. We have Elizabeth Hartman as Mrs. Brisby. We have Dom DeLuise as Jeremy. He's the main one that I know from this cast because he has been in so many other of the Don Bluth movies as various creatures. I think he's the cat in all of the An American Tail movies, Tiger, and he pops up in other movies as well. And if I'm remembering correctly, he's also done a lot of live action comedy work as well. But if I'm remembering correctly, his son played the dad on Wizards of Waverly Place with Selena Gomez and everything like that. So if you want to reference there's something there. We have Peter Strauss as Justin. We have Arthur Mullet as Mr. Ages. Derek Jacobi as Nicodemus. Him I know. He plays the king in the live-action version of Cinderella that Disney did a couple of years ago. And he did a good job there. And then, but the other thing that I know him as is that he plays kind of an older version of the Master in Doctor Who at one point in time. That is like the Master when he's like had his memories where he's forgotten that he's a Time Lord and everything like that. He plays like the older version of him. So that's who I recognize him as. And then we have Paul Schenner as Jenner. I don't know. John Carradine as the Great Owl. Again, no idea. And then the last two that I do know, we have Shannon Dotterty as Teresa Brisby, who she later on would end up being in, I believe she's in Beverly Hills 90210 for the original series, I believe. And then I believe she also played, which is the role I know her from, is Prue in Charmed. In the first 3 seasons of Charmed, she plays Prue. And then Martin Brisby is Will Wheaton. So, Wesley Crusher from Star Trek. And from Stand By Me and all of that stuff. So, that stuff. Actually, this may have been made not too far or not around the same time as Stand By Me. But I've only seen Stand By Me a couple of times, and I do not remember what year it came out. So that's that. But there's all of that. I do very much like this movie. I love this movie. It's like so many of the different, it's like pretty much most of the movies that I'm going to talk about these. It's like with the Disney movies, it's like I love so many of the Disney movies that I talked about when I did those ones for the animated movies. Hi, silly girl, you're making funny noises, aren't you? Same thing with the Pixar movies, and then with these ones, pretty much the ones that I'm going to go through when I go through all these different movies, it's like, if I don't like one of the movies, I'm not really going to talk about it, because it's like, either I've never seen it, or I just don't like it, or it's not one that I care enough one way or the other to want to talk about. But with this one, I love The Secret of NIMH. It's just this fun little adventure story that has some slight Disney homage stuff in it with the fact that, the talking smart animals and everything like that. But they give a reason for why they're smart that's not just magic. Okay, it's human genetic experiments on rats, but still, and then the amulet is somehow magic. Where the amulet came from, I have no idea. That's never explained in the movie. But that's what we have here. I thank you for watching. I hope you enjoyed the video, and I hope you have a nice rest of your day. And if you haven't watched The Secret of NIMH for a while, go and watch it. I can't do justice for how good of a movie it is. Bye!